saying?
Yeah.
Because again, here's the thing. I've heard, when I first heard the horns, it was interesting. I said, look, I don't know that God's necessarily going to allow everybody on earth to hear the trumpet judgments in heaven as they're trumpeted, but I said, I think everybody on earth thinks it's going to be Louis Armstrong sounding. And I'm serious. I mean, I think unless it's a modern jazz quartet, they wouldn't have a framework to reference it. But some of the stuff in the Ukraine sounded like almost, if you will, like foghorns, yet it was a transcendent. You know how as sound basically is it modulates, okay? It has a waveform that travels through travels through space, the atmosphere, whatever, not space, but the atmosphere. But this thing was more haunting. It was almost like if you will, it was like a giant foghorn with no point of origin, but a standing horn emanating from multiple points. That's the best way to explain it. And that's just one in the Ukraine. So I guess now that everything in that 5-year-old prophecy, and by the way, if somebody's got a copy of that, would someone please email it? I've got all my tapes from every radio show I've ever done, and I just don't remember what show, and unfortunately when those are being taped, they weren't, delineated well enough, but the gist of it is the invisible's coming visible, and what you're talking about, the clashing of swords, I believe, Tom, that's not just speculation or juxtaposing your thoughts on the events. I believe that's really happening, because I can tell you that's identical, and how you described it as to the prophecy I gave 5 years ago, maybe even 7 years ago. But anyway, there is a prophecy I gave on my radio show, and like a dummy, I don't know where I put it. Probably in my filing system, and who knows where that's at. But the point is that I think it's critical for people to understand the lateness of the hour. They can mock, they can sneer, they can jeer, they can deny, they can belittle, they can slander, they can damn, they can do everything they want. But that doesn't protect them from when their eyes are open and their ears are open, and something much bigger, something much more nefarious. And I can tell you this. One of the most important things that anyone has ever taught me was the Mr. Langley, sent to me by a dear friend. CIA guy said the entire purpose of transforming the Earth, and terraforming was my word, with the chemtrails was to change the dispersion of light. When God sent the rainbow, you're going to love this, when God sent the rainbow after the flood, saying he wouldn't destroy the Earth by water again, by taking that rainbow apart, if you will, and absolutely interfering with the light realm, L-I-G-H-T realm, of the different frequencies of light, they're enabling these things that God, in essence, imagine this, imagine the rainbow as God created as being a barrier to the principalities and powers of the air. In other words, it was our, if you want to say, force field, the force of Almighty God to keep those things out of us as we tamper. And that's why the Lord says that he's going to destroy those who destroy the earth. But this man was one of the highest-ranking CIA guys, and on his deathbed, he basically had a conversation with a man I know, and that's what was given to him, the most amazing understanding of why HARP exists and all this stuff. The Mayans, the Aztecs, the Incas, the Egyptians, by the way, mummified their dead because they knew there would be a time when they'd be brought back to life. Not just, quote, in the Book of the Dead. They knew they were coming back. And so it's something that's important for people to understand. So what you're saying about the Mayans of 2012 seems to be the revolving door for hell on earth. That's the best way I can describe it.
Yeah, and the other thing is, people who may, think that the prophecy that you gave, the conversation around what are these strange noises on the earth, whether or not those particular noises are related to supernatural conflict exists, period. Or if you don't believe that, then you deny the Bible. That angels, there are good angels and bad angels, and there is supernatural warfare that is involved right now in the world around us. But we know that in addition to the facts of basic spiritual warfare, that there is coming a time where there is going to be war in the heavens. In other words, the conflict is going to be it's going to be increased to a new level. And that was the point that when Gary, I can't even repeat exactly the words he was telling me, these people in this community and what they were hearing, and everybody was saying it sounded like trumpets, and what they were saying to him is it doesn't sound like trumpets at all, it sounds like the clanging of metal against metal. And the minute Gary said that, man, I could see angelic warfare. And the fact that it is so intense now that it is starting to bleed over from in their dimension into ours, because there still is no explanation about what these noises are. Now, it could be the government's doing experiments, it could be HARP, it could be something else. I certainly have no insight on what's going on. All I can tell you is what my first initial and immediate gut reaction was to the way it was described to me that day, and it literally caused the hair to stand up on the back of my neck, and the first thing out of my mouth was, Gary, is something starting to bleed over from the angelic realm? And it caused Gary to pause, too, and then we had a conversation around that. Well, what does this got to do with what we're talking about tonight? Petrus Romanus, E.T., extraterrestrials, the Maya, Aztec knowledge, David Flynn. What it has to do with is that these Maya prophesied that their gods were going to return, and they set that year in the year 2012. And ladies and gentlemen, we're here. This is 2012. And these multiple prophecies, some of them are thousands of years old. All of them are at least hundreds of years old. And some of these predictions are from people who are very well respected within evangelical and Catholic Christianity, who esteemed these people as being people of God. Oh, one other thing, by the way, David Wilkerson, who tragically died last year, he also said, Steve, something that sounded very much like the description you were making, how that as we get nearer to the end, their manifestations would start breaking through, and people would start seeing things and hearing things that were historically unprecedented, that would illustrate that this conflict, this period of time, darkness against evil, the intensity of it would be such that it would literally start manifesting itself within our physical world. He said that in his book, The Vision, many years ago. At least I think it was in his book, The Vision. If it wasn't that, it was another prophecy, and probably now that I've said that, somebody's going to make me have to find it, which I'll do. But these cultures, they believe. So if you're talking about Viracocha of the Inca, Kulkulcan and Bolanyactecu of the Maya, Quetzalcoatl of the Aztec, they believed that these gods would return at the end of their calendar date, the year 2012. But what Flynn did was, first of all, he recognized, oh, it's almost 11. Are we quitting at 11?
No, we're going on. You don't know that. Now, from now on, time will be no more.
Steve and Tom, let me make an announcement to those that are listening on Blog Talk. You want to switch over to OmegaManRadio.com. That's the live, uncensored stream. Blog Talk will go off at the 3-hour mark for the stream, although you can still listen to it at OmegaManRadio.com, so no worries. Keep going.
And we also may have some questions from listeners. I get all of that. So I'll try to do this real quickly. But part of the legitimate interest that David Flynn had concerned not just the year 2012, the prophecy of the return of these various entities and all that, but how all of this stemmed from the obvious fact that, first of all, the Maya, they were either unquestionably gifted mathematicians and astronomers or something else, because they measured or had knowledge of the length of the solar year, for instance, way more accurate than did the Europeans in the Gregorian calendar. They precisely oriented their sacred buildings and cities with stars and star clusters, particularly, interestingly enough, Pleiades and the Orion Nebula, which is associated throughout the ancient Middle East with Osiris, Apollo, and Nimrod. The pre-Columbian book, the Codex Dresdensis, what's also just known as the Dresden Codex by the Yucatec Maya, it's famous for the first known related illustrations of very advanced calculations, astronomical phenomena. So the question then is, how were the pre-telescopic Maya, who didn't even have the wheel, how were they so uniquely aware of such important knowledge. And that's what's unclear. So that was what implied to a guy like David Flynn that there is a mystery here that needs to be solved. And what David discovered through a tremendous amount of research was that the Maya, the Aztecs, the Mesoamericans, they themselves, as well as did many other archaic cultures, they credited that knowledge as having been brought to them by ancient gods that came to the earth, and throughout Mesoamerica, it appears that they came through some kind of stargate, at least in their mythos. They have these big gated constructs that are built in Tiwanaku, various other places, that they ascribed as a portal through which the god had a mysterious kind of key, and those gods would come. Now, that sounds like a fairy tale, right? But it's the only explanation we have from their history about where this unprecedented knowledge that they had that was far in advance of much of the rest of the world, where that knowledge came from. So what happened was, in 2008, David Flynn started making discoveries. And if you look at RaidersNewsUpdate.com/giants.htm, you'll see that much of the information, the size and the scope of it, simply surpasses comprehension. I don't know how many times I've read that article. David actually contacted me. He said, I'm using Google Earth and some other above Earth orbiting satellites. And once again, he said, I think I found something nobody's ever saw before. He wrote a bunch of the information, sent it to me. I edited it. I kind of cleaned up the language, if you will. So he and I kind of, sort of, wrote the article together, but none of the revelation was mine. It all came from David. Every bit of it was his. And what he found was mammoth traces of intelligence, carved in stone, literally covers hundreds of square miles. And I wrote at the intro of the article that, in my opinion, it was possibly the strongest evidence that was ever detected of prehistoric engineering by those ancient entities that were known and feared throughout the ancient world as gods. But I was talking about, of course, the giant offspring of the Watchers. Because what David did was, in similar fashion to how modern archaeologists, have recently found ruins of hidden Mayan temples in the Guatemalan jungle using these satellites, well, David, he used Earth orbiting satellites, and he imaged this vast network of patterns that surround Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, South America. They extend over 100 miles south into the Bolivian desert. But what's strange about them is that there are patterns that display geometric repetition, interlocking rectangular cells, mounds, perfectly straight lines that are cut deep through the rock into the earth, and it goes across everything. I mean, the topographical features, high plateaus that surround the lake, through floodplains, through hills, through cliffs, through mountains, these deep, straight, perfect lines that lay out these patterns upon the earth. There is no technology on earth that could explain how in the world these patterns were created. And I am still to this day astonished. I think, frankly, Steve, I think the only reason why National Geographic or somebody else hasn't picked that article up and wrote something about it is, first of all, they don't want to deal with the ramifications, and secondly, they have no clue how to explain what we're looking at. So
well,
we
Tom, hold that thought because we're going to get aced out with the changeover. Bruce, do you want to go ahead and announce it one more? And
yes,
we'll
sir.
Stay until we come back.
We need those out there that are on Blog Talk to now switch over to OmegaManRadio.com if you weren't listening there already. And you'll be able to hear this final segment tonight. We're still live on tape, and this will be available up in the archives later, the full 4 hours, for those that were on BTR and didn't make the switch. We're now live on the 4th hour. Continue on, guys.
Go ahead, Tom.
Well, I'll try to do it quickly, but the whole point is this. 12 miles south of Lake Titicaca, located within the center of an array of geoglyphs, there are megalithic ruins. There at Tiahuanaco. Many people are aware of these, by the way, and other New Agers have written about it. It's actually known as the American Stonehenge, the Baalbek of the New World. That's one of the titles that's given to it. And if you know anything about Baalbek, you've got these enormous stones protruding up out of the earth. You've got the what do they call it, the stairway of the giants there, where you've got a stairway going up into what at one time, prehistorically, was a giant temple. And in order to make those steps fit your natural stride, you would have had to have been just enormous, something like 18, 20 feet tall, whatever, for those steps to relate, to a normal stride walking up.
And by the way, Tom, the guy that has actually he took Dr. Muldeshef is one of the Ernest Muldeshef is one of the most famous eye surgeons in the world. The only man to ever, I bet, transplant a complete good night an eyeball, even into the optic nerve. I mean, that's pretty good. He took one of Russia's most famous physiologists, okay? Actually, I think it was a professor at one of the universities, and he took him to Baalbek. And they actually have the footprints in that thing, and when I tell you the footprint, they have footprints that are in limestone that are huge. When I say huge, I'm not talking 36, I'm not even talking 48 inches. I'm talking somewhere close to 5 and 6 feet. Baalbek also has the largest single quarried stone in the history of the world, and it's called Stone of the Pregnant Woman. Saying all that, the point is Baalbek is supposedly, underneath Baalbek, is the largest hive, and I don't know, I can't prove this, but I was told this by guys that fight these things, literally, is the largest hive, or if you will, repository of giants and stasis, S-T-A-S-I-S, and it's interesting if people understand where Baalbek is, and again, in the Hebrew, they used to refer to a lot of those areas as the Valley of the Rephaim. And, I argue with a lot of my critics and people who came after me. The Rephaim are the giants. The Nephilim are the fallen ones. And I make the distinction again that giants are not demons. Demons are not giants. The book of Enoch teaches that the demon spirits just came from the, if you will, the murdered or the giants that were slain. And that as these giants that were slain, their bodies are reconstituted through genetic engineering, these demon spirits will enter back into them, reanimating the body, and they got long memories, and they got the same appetite for flesh, that they've always had. So it's interesting, isn't it? We hear about certain national soft drinks using aborted fetuses and stuff. See, what I'm trying to say, ladies and gentlemen, our entire atmosphere is being reconfigured for these things to return. And, Tom, do you remember the Norway spiral back in, what was it? Yeah. I think what people need to understand, even at Tiahuanaco, and I was just told by a former park ranger in Utah, it seems like Utah and the Four Corners region of the United States, where they actually have an area called the Valley of the Giants, that the spirals, every place I have been able to type spirals, both to prehistory and I'm talking, ancient history, the spiral was always a sign, if you will, of the location of a stargate, angel gate, whatever you want to call it. So remember who was in Norway when that appeared in the sky, and the blue beam. And if anybody doesn't know what it is, just Google Norway spiral, and you'll probably get the mail online. What I'm saying is what you're saying about all of the Mayan, Aztec, Incan, they all A-L-L, attribute their building of their empires to the giants that came from the east. And that's exactly where I was going with that. And David didn't just make that statement, but he went into tremendous research about all of the different cultures around the world that explained what otherwise cannot be explained.
You're talking about some of the biggest stones in the world. People could go to Google, by the way, and they can type in Baalbek and then hit images and look at some of those stones. I mean, we don't have equipment in the world today that could fashion those stones and set them in place, and yet the original foundation for some of those large temples there in Baalbek, you can see the original stones, and then you can see all the cultures that followed. The Romans, the Greeks, they put their little dinky stones on top of it and rebuilt over and over again, and then a war would happen and somebody would tear it up and then they rebuild again. But look at the foundation stones. Who in the world built them? Because there was no empire that followed whoever built them that could repeat that technology. In fact, at Tiahuanaco, there's no stones there that are as big as the ones at Baalbek, but there is one of the largest single stones ever to be moved and put into a building anywhere on Earth. It's actually 400 tons. So think about that. But the mystery is, the experts say that it was transported to Tiahuanaco. From a quarry that is over 200 miles away. That's where that stone came from, 400 tons. So imagine how incomprehensible it is when you realize that the route of transport for a 400-ton stone over 200 miles had to be taken through a mountain range up to 15,000 feet. Who did that? We're talking there. You know, some of the extra biblical texts talk about some of these giants being as much as 200 feet tall. Well, there had to be something, because otherwise there's no conventional explanation for how those stones could be moved 200 feet through 15,000 feet above sea level, 200 miles, and then put into place in some of the temples that are there. And then you get these conventional historians that tell us that the structures at Tiahuanaco are only about 600 years BC, and that a pre-Inca civilization that didn't even have the benefit of a wheel or any other type of, it didn't even have modern written language. I guess they put these 400-ton stones on the back of their ponies, their mules, and jacked them up there somehow, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I can tell you something interesting. As I've studied this, I had Brian Snoddy, SNODDY. If people want to go to my website, stevequayle.com, click on the Giants section and go to the illustrations. I don't know if you've ever seen that. I'll email it to you.
Okay.
But Brian did an email for me. The Giants had an ability, and I was told by people who have talked about this, and people smarter than I did, but they had a form of harmonic levitation, okay? They were able to offset gravity by emitting a sound through their nose and their, now understand, these are big guys, okay? And I don't understand how it did it, but if you take your hand and pound the desk, you watch stuff move, because obviously you're creating a shock wave. They were able to create harmonic levitation, and nobody in the world has ever said this but me. So if you hear it, ladies and gentlemen, they're just parroting it, because nobody in the world knew it until a certain person told me that. I didn't come up with it. The bottom line is that they were able to literally change the gravitational field of the surrounding area around the rocks and if you will, float them on gravity waves. Now that's mind-blowing.
Well, and some type of technology like that corresponds to what the first Spanish chroniclers who arrived with the conquistador Pizarro in Inca, that was what they explained, that Tiahuanaco, in this instance, had been constructed by a race of giants using a science that they didn't understand. They called it Horus. that before Chamacpaca, which was the period of darkness and the time of the flood and all that they had done this all before then, and that it was, in fact, it was so long before the Inca arrived that those great temples and stuff were already in ruins. Their early history says it was already in ruins, and they only had oral history about what had happened there, but that it was giants that had been created by Viracocha, or Coculcan to the Maya and Quetzalcoatl to the Aztecs, the god that they said came from the heavens. So in other words, the Watchers, those who descended from the heavens. And Inca mythology involving the giants, followed by a world deluge, well, that corresponds perfectly with all the legends we know, from the Maya to the Olmec to the Aztec cultures of Mexico. Those stories are all consistent with Sumerian and Hebrew accounts of the flood and of the giant Nephilim, whose history of human sacrifices, by the way, also parallel Mayan rituals. The victims of Maya had their arms and legs held down while a priest would cut their chests open and rip their hearts out. And
by the way, let me just put it into perspective. Historians used to argue about that, but they were bloody, and I mean bloody cannibals. And it's my contention that many of the giants existed, and that these guys were basically kept from being eaten. The priesthood would keep from being eaten by the giants that were alive during those days by feeding them, and feeding them the sacrificed bodies, etc. On the heart. They probably ate the heart. But I think what's important for people to understand is Pizarro. What was the name of his chronicler, the Catholic priest?
Oh, yeah, I want to say Jimenez or something. I don't know.
Yeah, but anyway, it was something like that, and he basically told of an encounter where he and Pizarro and the men went into, and that the women had been forcibly, and I'm sorry to be gross, but split open by the giants raping them, and that they said God in heaven sent lightning bolts, and the Indians literally showed all of the, if you will, the faces of the rocks that were scorched with lightning bolts, and literally destroyed those giants on the spot. Now that's pretty interesting, okay? Because this isn't, this is before the Sci-Fi Channel, of course, and this is before the skeptics could get on their computers. But the point is that's 1590? I mean, it's really old chronicles, and these people aren't sitting there trying to say, gee, I'm bored in a new land where people cut people's hearts out and behead them and then toss their carcasses to giants. I mean, these guys were, if you will, they were the news reporters of their day, and they hadn't been bought off by the foundations of the world to control them. So the point is that they were telling what they were being told by the natives. Now, that's a first-hand account. That's a far different thing than all of the nonsense that we're being, exposed to daily. But continue on, because the Mayans, the Aztecs, and Incas all owe their origin to the fallen ones. Okay.
Yeah, and so the Maya prehistory echoes the advent of the Watchers, their giant offspring, but it also looked forward to a particular date, one date, 2012, the year that you and I are in right now, sitting here talking to only God knows how many people, and that could be beyond significant because it was around the year 2000. Well, it was in 2005. I happen to know that because the date is on the article when David Flynn wrote it. And David Flynn wrote a landmark article. This is one of his articles that has been fantastically ripped off by an awful lot of people. But he wrote it for my news service, the Raiders News Update. And we published it in 2005. In fact, I even got it published in 2005 by the UFO magazine and several others at the same time. So there's numerous ways to verify when he wrote it. But it was based on mutual research that we were investigating at the time. But he wrote the article. I didn't have anything to do with it, and the brilliance is all his. The article was called An Occult Translation of the Roswell Event Countdown to 2012. I've seen, by the way, that research, even very recently, this year, in so-called brand new books, where authors are out there and they're doing shows and they're making a name for themselves, and they have not given David one piece of credit, and it is almost a word-for-word ripoff of his occult translation of the Roswell Event Countdown to 2012. It was unprecedented at the time. It later formed the basis of his presentation at the 2005 Ancient of Days Conference in Roswell, New Mexico. Oh, and this reminds me, one of the things that we want to be able to do, Brenda, David Flynn's wife, she sent me, I don't know how many, but I think I've got maybe at least a half dozen or more of David Flynn's video presentations that he made over the years at Roswell and other places. I have not been able to get Richard Hoagland to respond to give me the one presentation that David was very proud of that he did with Hoagland, so I probably am not going to get that, and Hoagland may not even have it anymore. But we did get these other ones, and what I'd like to do when we put his book out is just provide that DVD with all of those video presentations for free with the book. So we'll talk about that more later. But the occult translation of the Roswell event countdown to 2012 tied a lot of this stuff together. It tied the Mayan together, but also with the UFO and alien abduction phenomenon that we started out talking about, and even with the role of the Vatican. This was a feature article. It's even people who have credited David, it's been resourced, Donna tells me, hundreds of times by media, republished in magazines, print publications around the world. But what the extraordinary findings that David made actually foretold, that's the part that remains hidden to most of the world. Because what David did was like Dr. I.D.E. Thomas, you know, our mutual friend.
Yes.
Thomas is still alive, by the way. You know, he's going to be 90 here pretty quick, and he's still, at times, he's still very sharp. But he, Dr. Jacques Vallée, Chuck Missler, others, like them people, Flynn, he became fascinated with a mysterious connection between the Watchers, aliens, the coming of the Antichrist, the Mayan date 2012, and he saw that there was somehow a fiber. There was a string that was running through and connecting all of these occult aspirations, even including Freemasonry and other Illuminatus related to the subject. So, if you read David Flynn's feature article, which we're going to include, the original 2005 article is going to be included at the back of the new David Flynn collection. If you read that article, you'll see how that he starts out citing how in 1928 the occult visionary Manly P. Hall had been writing about the Great Seal of the United States, but that careful analysis of the seal that Hall was writing about disclosed that there was this whole mass of occult and Masonic symbols. Hang on, I'm getting interrupted. Talk for a minute.
Well, I think, too, ladies and gentlemen, one of David's gifts was to be able to process an intense amount of data, and then with God's direction and guidance, put it together so all of these discontinuous or seemingly strewn through the annals of history, it would all be tied with a single thread. And I got to tell you something, you can sum the whole thing up in spiritual conflict. That's why for those of you that are listening too, I recommend above all things, go to DerekPrince.org. DerekPrince.org, and it'll bring you to the site. The most impressive and, in my opinion, most life-changing group of tapes I ever listened to, which started me on my whole quest for the truth, was Spiritual Conflict. I think they call it the Spiritual Conflict series. So for those of you that really want to get a handle on this, now Tom was talking about the Aztecs, the Incans, and the Mayans. You know, I can't get over the fact that we now have little babies and their aborted fetal tissue being used as flavor enhancers in more than just soft drinks. And you ask me why God would judge America. One of the most interesting points that I have to deal with, or points of contention, is, well, God wouldn't judge America. Look at all the good things we do. And I said, name them. And usually they'll say, well, you send more missionaries. No, we don't. That's not true. And for the record, ladies and gentlemen, it's real simple. God says, if you do right, you'll be blessed. If you do wrong, you'll be cursed. And I've said this 1,000 times over the years I've been on talk radio, that God judges nations, and he judges them in time. He judges individuals as far as their eternal, where they're going in eternity. But there comes a time now when all hell is breaking loose. And as the hell literally breaks loose, people are going to see more and more strange phenomenon. That's why I encourage every single person that is listening to the show to memorize Romans 8, especially Romans 8, 26, 27, 28. And when Tom was talking about some of the giants being 200 feet tall, if you want to Google Colossus of Rhodes, one of the ancient wonders of the world, that was done in a life-size sculpture that stood over the harbor at Rhodes, the island of Rhodes, Rhodes, in the Greek islands. What was fascinating about the Colossus of Rhodes, though, is, again, you're dealing with the word the Titans. And the Titans were basically the elder gods, or in our case of talking, we are talking about the fallen angels that left their first estate. And so when you read about all the children of the Titans, and it's going to be interesting because most people don't understand that almost every single heavenly body or moon of our planets, and at least our solar system, are named after the Titans. Now, why is that? Did somebody just say, oh, let's say we got 12 things we got to name, and there's, 12 Titans, and maybe more than that, 1, 2, 3, more than that. The point I'm trying to make to you and for you is ancient history is before your eyes at all time. As Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. That which has been will be. And I think it's important for those of you that when you start to understand this, I made a statement earlier in the show that southern Utah has some amazing glyphs. I won't tell you where it's at, but I got a call and an email from somebody, and they shared with me they were a park ranger in a certain area in Utah. They literally have the same exact petroglyphs as they do in the Australian outback in the Ayers Rock, Ayers area. And it's the, I think Stan corrected my pronunciation, Deo did, but it's called the Wajina, W-O-D-J-I-N-A or something. I used to call them the Wajinga, but it's a Wajina. And the almost identical parallel are in Utah. So tell me this, you think really the Australians settled the United States before the Chinese? No. What I'm trying to tell you is that the stargates that Tom is talking about, Tiwanaku, the usual place for a stargate is when the ley lines intersect. Every sacred place that's known as a sacred place has a stargate. When you see a spiral, whether it's a Norway spiral, please go Google that story, the Norway spiral, and then ask yourself this. Was a message being sent? Was it Project Bluebeam? Whatever you want to speculate on. But look who was in Norway. I won't tell you who was. You can look it up. And it's interesting that the ancients always equated the spirals with the entrance or exit point of fallen angels. Tom, are you there?
Yeah, and actually isn't in even some of the cave drawings where you see these very strange alien-looking like characters, you repeatedly see that spiral design as having been drawn on the cave walls, and that too is a phenomenon that recurs around the world, right?
Absolutely, and since they didn't have technical drawing and 3D laser printers, that's the best they could do. But the spiral, if you look at that's a very interesting thing because it's called the Coriolis effect. If you look at the galaxy, the spiral galaxy, if you look at the way water drains down